those. So these are some tools that we kind of recommend. Explain those a little.
Yeah, you'll probably run across these just over Google searches and stuff like that, but there's a lot of really good information that you should probably, if you're just getting into Angular and want to learn more about it, spend some time ahead of time to really learn the ecosystem of what's out there. And there's lots of really good, like Egghead IO's videos are really good, short, quick lessons, and lots of really good resources out there. There's another, I don't know, maybe spend some time if you haven't already. If you're not using Node for some like client-side tools, it's definitely worth getting into. They're really simple commands you can run to like really scaffold up a whole entire system that does all your testing for you automatically using Grunt, or now there's what's it called, Gulp is a new one. But there's lots of really good tools out there that you should get into.
Yeah, and I forced Travis to put this one on here just because when I first started Angular, that's the NG boilerplate project, which it's I don't think it's been updated in a little while, but it has a good layout structure for your first project. And basically, I wrote a project and found that and threw everything I did away and structured it like that, and everything has gone a lot cleaner. So that's just one example structure I meant. I suggest looking at it if you're starting with Angular.
Go back one second. I was just going to say, I really like Yeoman, and
Yeoman's good too.
Yeah, I really like the Angular generator. There's this new one that's called Generator Radian. It's still rough around the edges, but if your flavor is like using Coffee and Jade and Sass, that's kind of centered around that. So I wanted to just kind of emphasize, like, if you spend some time just kind of looking at what the ecosystem of the Angular module pattern is, that will give you kind of a much better understanding instead of just diving straight into like kind of two-way binding like how I did. So I kind of tried to break it up into different segments of what those different module types are. Correct me if I'm wrong, you guys are welcome to make fun of me. But the stuff that, if you're just wanting to keep a reference to the data, you'd most likely want to just use a dot value. I should probably mention up here. So when you're talking to the Angular module function, if you just pass the one parameter, it's a getter, and if you pass the second parameter with the dependencies, optional dependencies, that's how it's grayed out, it would be a setter. So, and then from there, once you've got a reference to that module, you make these different subtypes. And so, let's speak to something on here.
These are the basics that you're going to need in order to get started on your first Angular project. If you kind of separate out your project, considering that your view logic goes in these, your logic goes in those, your data goes in those, then you'll usually be set up in a good sense. But the nice thing about Angular is how it kind of forces you into this paradigm that's going to make you successful in your project.
Separating, yeah, your concerns.
Okay, so one of the major gotchas, if you don't understand how it works, is two-way binding. But it's also one of the main proponents, or the main reasons that people look into Angular. It's the reason I originally came into Angular, because I heard that it had two-way binding, and that was the big headache in jQuery, was trying to get everything synced. So I figured if that's where I'm running into most of the gotchas, then explaining how two-way binding works in the Angular world would help you avoid most of the gotchas. Then everything doesn't seem so mystical and magical when it breaks, and feel good when it does work. So I wanted to briefly describe how it's working behind the scenes, what it's actually doing, because it's actually using just a lot, and this is one of the great things about Angular, is using a lot of the components the exact same way you would use them if you were to write two-way binding yourself in Angular. It's just setting it up for you in a way that works. So the way that the two-way binding in Angular works is that it implicitly sets up watches on your templates when you define them and you compile them, or an Angular compiles them. So this is an example of a template with binds in it. So you can see here that it's using different examples. Well, I guess this is more of a controller. So this would be the template of the controller. But it uses ng-bind, which is one way of binding things to your DOM. And then it has some mustache template things in there to kind of show you other ways to value it. How many, if you were to guess, so throughout this thing, I've kind of peppered in some expect statements just as an example of, and so all of these are going to be true, but if you were to guess, how many watches would you say would come from compiling that template? Anyone have any clue? Well, it's going to be 1, 2. There's going to be a few more than 2. There's actually 4. And it's because there's 1 coming from this ng bind up here, and there's 3 of them for each one of those expressions that's being evaluated. And what's going to happen is Angular is going to compile that. It's going to set up watchers on those expressions, and then it's going to attach them to the scope. So if you actually look at the scope.watchers, you will see all the watches that Angular is doing for you. So if you do that, it's going to be 4. Same way, you've probably seen this a million times. If you define your own watch, tell it what expression you're watching, give it the callback function, expect it to be 5. So Angular's doing the same thing you're doing, it's just doing it behind the scenes for you. This doesn't actually happen though until, who here has heard of the term of Angular Digest? A few, about half of you, that's good. It's kind of a behind the scenes. They mention it a lot, but they don't really often have you directly run the digest yourself or do the digest yourself. So it's something that you're not going to usually run into very frequently. But the view is updated every time a digest cycle runs in Angular. So in this case, if I were to take this template, over there I'm compiling it, I'm attaching 1 item to the scope, I'm compiling the template, which binds the scope and the template together. If I were to do, let's see, the first element, grab the contents of this ng bind equals num, that is going to be random stuff. Nothing happened at that point. It's just going to be whatever's in the tag. But then if I run a scope digest and do the same thing again, it's going to not be random stuff. It's going to be 2. So when the digest ran, it went through the template, found that bounding, ran the watches, any ones that needed to be executed and updated appropriately. Anything you want to mention about that, Travis?
No, that sounded great.
Okay. The way you usually hear about a digest in Angular is through apply. Anytime that you want Angular to run a digest and you want it to explicitly run it, not just behind the scenes, which it usually does for you, you have to call apply. So an example of that would be if you're using third-party libraries, or if you're using like jQuery even, and you're using their kind of bindings and all their kind of stuff in their jQuery land. Angular is not going to be aware of anything that's happening to its templates for the most part. So in this case, we've got the same template going on here. If I look at the 4th tag and look at its contents, I'm going to expect it to be faulty because nothing's run at this point. The value hasn't been updated. Then I'm going to attach a jQuery event handler on the same tag and say, if you click this, then you're going to update that scope value to be 10. So that should update this little expression right here to be 10. So then I click it. What do we think the value of that tag is going to be? Guesses? It's going to be the same. It's going to still be faulty. Nothing happened. But if we were to do the same thing and call scope apply after we do that click handler, that alerts Angular that something changed. It runs a digest, and the watch is going to fire, and all that kind of stuff happens, and eventually it's going to end up being 10. So we were outside of Angular land, and we had to tell Angular that something happened. So the two-way binding, when you look at it in this sense, is not as magical anymore because you need to kind of, poke it and prod it to do its things. But if you're working in Angular land, that's not really the case. It then becomes magical because if you look at the Angular source code, it's peppered and scattered with applies everywhere, and it's running digests and all this kind of stuff automatic for you behind the scenes. So if we look at that thing, it's going to start off to be faulty just like before. Browser trigger is a function that I pulled out of the ng scenario, I think, for emulating an actual browser click on and that Angular could sense. So now it's using this ng click expression over here, and I'm clicking it. And what are we expecting to be inside fourth now? Guesses? It's going to be 15. It worked, and I didn't have to call apply or digest or anything because Angular is aware of it. So some of you have probably seen this diagram before. This is on the Angular documentation somewhere. This is a basic example of that digest loop and how the native stuff that's going on behind the scenes and the Angular JavaScript stuff happen here. This apply being the kind of the boundary that's telling Angular, hey, start doing stuff. So I kind of went through the Angular source code and pulled out the kind of applicable parts that demonstrate this in code form. I'm not really a visual guy. I'm more of a code guy, and I like looking at code. So I thought that would help explain this a little better. If you look here, the apply is going to run a digest. The digest loop here is saying that at the beginning there's an eval async queue. Does anyone here know what that is or know what it does? Because I don't.
Me neither.
Great. Mm-hmm. Okay. And is eval async, is that kind of something that you can add your stuff to your own, or is that more just the Angular behind the scenes thing? Do you know?
I think that's, well, it's using the browser filter
Okay.
but
So
it's also part of the expression, because you can pass expression that has to evaluate the expression.
yeah, so that's what's happening here. I got the source code for an apply right here, which if you look at it, it's actually only a few lines. I didn't cut much out here. And it is just taking expression. You can either call it with no expression like I did in that example, and it will evaluate, nothing will happen, and then it will eventually get to this finally and run the digest. So that's how I was using it. But as you're saying, you could also pass in an expression in here. It will evaluate the expression, and then it will run the digest. So you can call it both ways, giving it either an expression or just calling it on its own. And that's going to call this digest in the finally block. And this I did cut a lot out of. The digest is a lot more complicated than just this. But I wanted to kind of get the loops, how they're working and what they look like. So you can see here at the beginning, it's going to process this. It starts off, and one really distinct thing between the two is you call and apply. Let me go back real quick, and you'll notice something. Is that it's calling digest on the root scope, whereas if you look at the actual digest, like if you were to call digest yourself, its target, which is where it's originally going to start, is going to be this, which is going to be maybe the root scope. It's going to be whatever scope you called it on. That's where it's going to start the digest. So that's one important thing to notice about an apply, and why you usually use apply is because it's going to propagate through the entire root scope, evaluate all the watchers, all expressions, and you're not going to miss anything. Whereas if you were to call digest on some child scope, it'll start from there and go on down, and some stuff above it might have been missed. So that's an important point. Its target is this. Starts out as not dirty. It does the asynchronous queue right here and loops through that stuff. Sets the target to current because it's going to actually walk the tree. And then right here, this is where it traverses the scope. So this is yeah. So the digest loop itself is this entire outer loop here. This inside the one is, I guess it's kind of not really. Yeah, watch loop. It's kind of on the inside there, but what it's actually going to do is, it's this one right here. It's going to loop through all of the watchers that exist, and it is going to evaluate each one of them according to its previous cached version and see if anything's changed. And it will, if something ended up changing, was dirty and it changed it, it's going to set it to true and do a whole nother digest. And I'll talk about it a little later, but that causes the digest to run multiple times and for everything to stabilize, as they call it. Yep. Good? Oh, that was pretty good. So let's see here. Dirty checking. this is how Angular keeps track of those changes that happen. That's what I just mentioned, is it's actually going through every watch. Now, it's important to realize it's not actually going through everything on your scope. I mean, things can be on your scope, and it's not going to keep tabs on them unless you put it in an expression on a template, or you explicitly add a watch that's going to watch it. So, but the way it watches those watches is it does dirty checking, where it actually loops through all of them, keeps a cached version of what the value used to be, compares it to what it is now, and if it's changed, then it will fire your watch for you. So this is an example of one of the first gotchas you're going to get to if you don't quite understand how those watches are being evaluated. So we have here an object called guy. I'm putting it on my scope. Then I'm just going to create some spy objects so I can kind of see what's being called and what's firing as I'm doing this. I'm going to attach a watch to the expression just guy. It's himself. Give it a callback. Attach a watch to guy.name, which is a property on guy, and give it a callback. And then I'm going to give a watch on guy expression, give it a callback, and I'm going to add this little magical third parameter called true. Well, not called true, but it is true. And then I'm going to run a digest. I reset all my my callbacks because they're all going to get fired the first time the thing digests. But then I want to attach this my own watch here. No, that's not a watch. Here's what I'm doing apply. I'm passing an expression just like we were talking about. I'm changing guy.name to Fred, which is going to fire watches. So here they are. What am I expecting? Which of these callbacks do you think are going to get fired and which ones aren't? Any guesses there? This one? Okay. Yes, that's right. This one's not going to be called. These two are going to be called. Why? Yeah, why is that the case? Yeah, it does an actual equals. Go ahead, what are you saying?
I was just going to say it watches the reference to the object. And so since it's the same object, it's not going to trigger it.
So this is the actual code for the evaluation of whether or not things have changed, whether or not they're equal. What it's doing here is the watch gets the current value, so whatever that may be, compares it to its cached version, which is watch.last. And at that point, watch.equal, that's this parameter right here, this true. So if it's false, it's going to say, okay, I'm just going to do this part, which is it's a few random things. But it's not going to do. This is the Angular.equals, which actually does a nested, not nested, but it does a traversal of the object and says, has anything changed on this object or any of its children, or so on and so forth. This does a deep comparison rather than a shallow comparison. And that's then if it has, it's going to evaluate true. So when I pass true in here, it actually did this equals statement. When I didn't pass true, it just did this part, and the object didn't change. The reference was still the same. It didn't look at its properties. It didn't look at guy.name, and so it didn't fire. So that's a common one that will get you. And not to say, it's important to know how it works. So you don't just want to go start throwing true around then on all your watches, because that's going to get expensive, you know, traversing all of these objects. But sometimes you need it, or sometimes you can just do what I did here and watch that property that you're interested in directly. So here's the loop. It's important to realize that the digest isn't just a simple execute once and it's done. It's a loop that goes over and over. And the reason it does that, as we mentioned, is if something dirties the execution context, I don't know what you want to call it. When it gets dirty, then it's going to run itself again because things might have changed. Your watch can actually change other things on the scope, and now it needs to check all those again to make sure nothing happened there. So this is a simple example of let's see. One thing to briefly mention: if you do a watch and you just pass a function, you don't give it anything else, that will fire every time a digest happens on that scope. It's not watching anything in particular. So I don't know what it's useful for other than counting how many times the digest has happened, but that's what I'm using for here. So I'm setting the digest count to 0, setting test equal to 1, setting a watch on that value. In my callback, I'm saying if scope.test is less than 4, increase scope.test by 1. And then I'm going to watch how many digests happen. Going to execute a digest, and now I'm going to expect digest count to be what? Any guesses? 4. Yep. It's going to, because it actually digested 4 times there in order to update the value and to actually stabilize. That's another gotcha that you can run into in Mr. Angular 2 binding world. So I have a template here. I put an ng repeat on this thing, a person, and in it I'm implicitly getting a watch. I think actually watch collection on this get people function, and that thing is gonna. So I'm gonna iterate over everything that get people returns, and kind of print out these person objects, whatever you want to call them. So the get people function is returning a list of people named John, named Fred. Compile that template with that scope. I'm wrapping this digest in a function for a reason you guys will soon find out. What do you guys think is going to happen here with this set of code? Going to work hunky-dory? Everything's going to work fine? Yeah? That's almost right. That's true. There is going to be a new array every time. But the part that it's actually getting caught up on is these object literals. There's going to be new object literals every time. The only reason I know that is because I thought it was going to just break with just a new array, but I tested it with just strings here, and it worked just fine. It didn't have any complaints. But as soon as you change these to objects and the watch is looking at these object literals, these references are changing every time that I call this function. And this function is going to be called every time there's a digest. So every time there's a digest, there's going to be a new object created called with the name of John, a new object created with the name of Fred, and it's going to compare it to the previous one. It's going to say that's not the same because it has a different reference, and the digest is going to get stuck in an infinite loop. So we're going to expect it to throw an exception, and it does. And so if you ever see that exception that says reached maxed iteration of digest loops, I think it's 10 is the default, then you probably did something like this. Or you have some kind of circular reference in your watches where they're interacting with each other in a not very good way. So there's probably a few ways around it. Go ahead.
Are we doing good on time? Does anybody have any questions so far?
Sorry. Okay. So there's probably a few ways to fix that. One way to fix it for sure is to make that array myself, make the reference to it, define these literals the first time, and now I'm just returning people, which is a reference to this, which means it's not recreating these object literals every time that watch fires. So I'm going to run this. I'm going to expect to find persons of length 2. So there's 2 people. So that's common gotcha. I think lots of people just say don't put a function in your ng repeat, or if you do, just be aware of not creating new objects every time you call your function.
Would that be a good use of my value that was injected into your scope?
Yes, it would, Travis. Great one. Use the dot. This is the one you'll probably run into this a few times and then see Misko replying in some Stack Overflow saying you should always put a dot in all of your model references on the scope. And I don't know, for a while there I wasn't doing it because I'm like, I know what's happening here. It's traversing the scope and it's not going to find it if, I mean, I know I'm always, it doesn't matter for me though because I know what scope I'm dealing with, you know, and I'm going to keep track of my scope so I'm not going to run into any issues. The problem where you run into that, which then I ran into later and realized I was kind of dumb, is that Angular is implicitly creating scopes for you all the time that you may not even realize. Child scopes that are going to ruin your expressions and then ruin your day. So this is an example of one right here where I have an ng repeat that's going to be stamping out a bunch of these buttons. And it's looping through all these people and make a button for each one. And if I click that button, or if I ng click that button, it's going to set person of the day to be, what am I going to do it to? Can you follow this code, Travis? I wrote it, so I can't follow it. Yeah, set an equal person.name, person.name. Yeah. Okay, so whichever button I clicked on is going to set that person's name, the person of the day. So I'm going to find a button to click. Expect the length to be 2. Yeah, that works. It stamps them out both just fine, all my buttons. I'm going to find the person of the day to be Fred. That's true. Works just fine. I'm going to click that button in a nice Angular-friendly way and say, click the button, click John's button, since there's 2 of them. And then when I look at person of the day down here, which is outside of the ng repeat, which is why you should be following this, what's it going to be? What is person of the day going to be? Any guesses? It's going to be Fred. Nothing changed, even though I clicked John's person of the day button. So yeah, the whole magic going on there behind the scenes is that ng repeat makes scopes of its own, even though I didn't tell it to. It just does that. And when I have this expression over here saying person of the day equals person.name, it looked at the scope, the current scope of that expression, which is actually a scope that I didn't make, and it assigned person of the day to be John. And so now I have a child scope that has a person of the day that is John, and a parent scope that has a person of the day being Fred, 2 different values. So the way to fix this, how would I fix this? Put it in an object. Exactly. So fix that. I'm now saying person of the day is now an object. The current one is going to be Fred. And if I'm going to click my button, it's now going to set person of the day dot current to person.name. And I'm going to ng-bind this thing outside here of person of the day dot current. And I'm going to click it, and it's going to be right this time. Not going to be Fred, it's going to be John. And the reason why is it's going to say, okay, you're trying to assign person of the day dot current to person.name. Well, it's not going to be able to find person of the day object on that child scope. It's not going to even know it exists. So it's going to look up the prototype chain for that scope, and it's going to say, does that person of the day exist on my parent? Then it's going to find it, and it's going to assign current to it, and it's all going to work, and everything's going to be all happy. So the idiom, I guess, is this, they say to just use dots in all of your models, especially if you're using them on your views, because when you're dealing with expressions on your views, it's sometimes ambiguous which scope you're running in. This is something I just threw in here at the end, just because while preparing my little section here on the two-way binding, I'm always telling people how cool the views are in Angular, that you can just throw promises on them and have to unwrap themselves, and as soon as they resolve, and you'll get the value on there. That used to be true, but it's not anymore apparently. They took that out in version 1.23, release candidate 3 or something like that. So if you're ever expecting your promises to unwrap themselves and show themselves in the view, you can still set, did it say? You can still use the parse provider and tell it to unwrap the promises. There's a value you can set and tell it to do that, but it's deprecated and it's going away, so you probably shouldn't. And don't let that gotcha get you. Just use a then, and as soon as the promise resolves, it'll be good. That's it for two-way binding. Question?
So going back to the apply from earlier, if I'm using the HTTP service within Angular to do a simple SHR request, and I want to pass in, and I get a promise back from that, and I want to pass in a success callback essentially, I have to use apply to make the callback. And I'm wondering why that is, since I'm using an Angular service.
On success for HTTP? Oh yeah, sorry. They told me to do this and I didn't. If he's using an HTTP service and you having a callback function on the success, you have to call apply in order for it to work. And you're wondering why that's the case, correct? Yeah. Okay. You know, Travis?
I don't know. As far as I know, it's because the digest for that round is already run, and that when you're doing an XHR request, it never gets it back. When it gets back, and then you get, hey, I got new data. Let's run it again. New data was clean. That's how I understand it.
Did you want to add something? Okay.
So from what I understand is that like the assignment of the callback is being made in that HTTP Angular is wrapping that the assignment of the callback, not necessarily the concept of
I've noticed that I think sometimes with callbacks in general, even in the Angular world, I think I've run into that before. It's just sometimes callbacks, since they're happening outside of the regular execution, they don't update appropriately. But for the most case in Angular world, they do. But yeah.
I use callbacks on promises all the time, basically requests, and usually they work. But it may be that you have to define the callback within the scope, not within the HTTP service, but in the scope where you actually want when it applies to occur. So you would put the promise chain in the scope, not in the HTTP service itself.
Okay. That sounds like a good call. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I believe that is it for us. Thanks for your time. What? Oh, we are taking questions. You're speaking, all right?
Yeah.
Not from you.
So my name is Sam Smith. I'm with SaltStack. Yeah. Oh, okay. Does that work? Good. Okay. So I'm with SaltStack. If you don't know what SaltStack is, it's a 100% open source config management remote execution framework written in Python. Competes with Puppet and Chef. It's a local company. And just a shameless plug, we're developing some enterprise software applications on top of SaltStack, and we just put out recs to hire 3 front-end developers and a UX designer to do Angular. So there you go, if you want to contact me or go to our website. So, and then some of the source codes I'm going to show today you can find here, and I'll show this at the end of the talk if you want to look it up. SaltConf is in 2 weeks, so anybody that uses Salt, who's interested in Salt, there's another shameless plug. Okay. So onto the problem. ng form, if you want to create dynamic forms, the biggest problem with Angular is, what I found is that ng form, the name, is not interpolated, and the input names are not interpolated. So if you're dynamically creating form elements, what do? Right? You can't change the name and expect to find anything. So if you want to do validation, you can't do validation because you don't have a way to get access to the validation values. You'll see the elements there, but how do you get a hold of them? Yes. Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. No, I'm going to go into how to do it with directives. So I'll be interested in how you do it without directives. Okay. So as far as I can tell, it's pretty difficult to do that. So I wrote some directives for that. So these directives are available on the links that I gave, so you're welcome to download them, use them. Used them a few times. So let me show you an example form. Okay, so let me escape from that. Let me show you an example of a dynamic web form that uses these directives to give you an idea of what's possible. So I've got a form with teams and players, and the players associated with the team, and it's just a little dynamic form. But I can do things like delete teams, create a bunch of teams. You notice when I deleted that one team, all of the players went away, so I'll give him a name, and I can assign him down here. He didn't update, and now he's updated. So this is a dynamic form. I can do the same thing with players. I can add players. I can delete teams in the middle. You know, they don't have to be deleted at the end. So it's a completely dynamic form that's a set of nested forms. So if we look at the HTML for this form, we'll see that we have the teams form right here. Is there I guess I don't have a mouse cursor. I've got a, yeah. You guys have a pointer? Nobody has a pointer? All right. You just don't know if people can see me when I stand up here. Maybe if I put it over here. Yeah. That'll work. That'll work. Now, am I blocking anybody? Okay. Is that readable? Good. Okay. So I have a form called teams. So that's and then I'm going to have some subforms. So I've got an ng repeat. For each team and teams, well, actually in this case I'm not subform, just inputs. So I'm going to have a team name, team ID, and then, whoops, sorry, I'm on the wrong one. There we go. Wrong page. Okay, so this is the edit form. Okay, so I have an ng repeat. So here's my outside form, teams form, and then I've got an ng repeat, and so I'm going to have nested inner forms. So I'm using ng form, which allows me to do a nested form instead of form. And then I'm using a directive au form name with team form and an interpolated index. So I can number my inner forms. So I now can write code that generates forms that have names that I can reference without having to, I don't know, I'd be interested in what you did to fix that problem. I also have an AU outer form that allows me to assign this form to this outer form so that when I want to do validation, the two are connected, so I can trace the validation. And then I have the controls in my form. And in this case, I've got an ng required, so I can show you what it means to have to look for the validation on the input. And in this case, since I don't have multiples of the inputs per form, I don't have to use the my input name. And then on the player form, I've got a similar thing for each player. I've got an outer form, and then I have an inner form where I have the form name and the outer form name. And I've got some ng requireds and stuff on those forms. So that's what the HTML looks like for that view. So when when I'm clicking on this guy here, you can see that I've got I get a validation that pops up for something that I created dynamically and gave it an assigned name. So if we look at the source code, and I do all my stuff in CoffeeScript, so please forgive me if this is not understandable. Most people familiar with CoffeeScript? A few of you. So it kind of makes sense, especially if you're a Python programmer. If you're a JavaScript programmer, just pretend that there are brackets and parentheses everywhere. Just put them in there. So I've got this invalid team, which basically is iterating. So it's taking my team's form, and then it's iterating through all of its subproperties that are team forms with an index. Because when I create a subform of an outer form, it gets attached by my directive so that it's a property of the outer form. So I have explicit access to it. And then I can check the error property to see if there's an error on that form. And then, invalidate it before I do the submission. Yes? Well, it doesn't do it. Well, okay. I tried using it for a long time, and I couldn't get it to work. Yeah, I'll have to. Okay, if there's a weird syntactical way to do that, I'd be interested in it. But yeah. Well, I'll show you. Maybe you can, because when I looked at the code, when I looked at what Angular did, I couldn't get access for validation because it wasn't in a place that I could get access to it. So, for example, if I set a breakpoint in here, invalid team, oops, okay. And then I want to look at normally, without the directive, this team form 1 and team form 2 don't show up there. Just one of them does. The first one you create, or the last one you create. But with the directive, then all of them are there. So you can access them from the team form. Oh, okay. They do aggregate. Okay, well, that's nice to know. Anybody, you know, I didn't, that's okay, that's all right. No, that's all right. Because actually, if that's there and it's not documented, it's great. You know, somebody should document it, right?
Yeah, it is. It's just, so the basic premise is you have a form, right? So there's players form. And then in your players form, you can create an NG form using player form. And if you do NG format, you have 10 of them. You'll have 10 NG forms that are all a child of the parent player form. And you can validate each of the child forms independently, but their validation errors propagate up to the parent. It works just like scope and verify. It's the same exact thing. It's just not obvious how it's used.
Yeah, but how do you get access to any of those validation errors
So
to display them?
you do how you do normally. So like your player form dot error dot dollar error, right? But in the child scope, it would be player form dollar error dot required whatever.
Okay, so you can't do any aggregated validation for form submission because you can't get back to them.
You can't get a specific child form error into the main form, but it'll tell you as a whole whether or not.
Yeah, but if I want to submit, if I want to pre-validate and do a submission to a backend, and I want to figure out where the error was, I can't do that because I don't have a way to get back to that scope because it's not.
It depends on how you implement the validation.
Yeah. Okay.
If you like commit to Angular, you just do it in the markup and you just use it as an expression. That's how I've always done it.
Oh, okay.
But
Okay. All right. Well, I guess if there's another way to do it, that's fine. Here's a way to do it with a directive, right? And maybe we could look at how to write a directive that mucks with the NG model and the NG form. So, so here's the directive for the form name. It's written in CoffeeScript, but you can see I'm including the interpolate service because I'm going to add interpolation to I'm going to interpolate the name. My link is the scope, the element, the attributes, and the control. And then I'm going to interpolate the AU form name attribute. So I call the interpolate function. I call elm.attribute to pull out the form name. And then I'm going to get an interpolation expression. I then need to pass in the scope so that it interpolates within the proper scope. So any scope variables that I use in interpolation will be correct. The inner form control is passed in as a control. Since I want to attach as a property of the parent form, I then get the parent of the inner form. I get my outer form attribute, which tells me what the name of my parent form that I want to attach to is. So now I get the correct parent. I then remove the inner form control that used to be there, which is the name given by ngRepeat, and then I give it my new name that I created for my interpolation directive and assign that to the attribute, and then I add that control so that it'll be part of everything that the control system works. So I have explicit control, I have two-way way to access all of my sub-forms, sub-elements, so I can go up and down and do any kind of validation I want. So I was trying to do certain types of validation. I couldn't make it work. Maybe that, something with those child scopes is kind of complicated, but this makes it easy. When you do this, then it trivializes anything you want to do because now when you look at your form control, you will see, all of these. You'll see all of the subforms as explicit. Here's team form 1 and team form 2. There'll be explicit properties of the team form controller with all of their errors, stuff like that. So it's easy to see what's going on. It's not, it's pretty explicit. And the same thing happens for the input name. It's not interpolated. So if you want to generate a bunch of inputs dynamically, similar to how I'm doing the forms, where you want to give them names and you want to remove them, delete them dynamically as part of the form, then this will allow you to do that. So it's similar setup. We need ng model. We interpolate the AU input form name. We get a transform name. We get our model controller is going to be the first control in the controls list. We attach our name control. And then we also add that to our form controller. So when we look at the form, we'll see those inputs with the name we gave them show up right there, so we know where they are, we know how to get a hold of them. So it makes it really easy to do any kind of validation you want to do, because you can explicitly go find the stuff you need by the name you gave it. And you can add inputs, delete inputs, and whatever name you gave them, it'll be there. You can depend on it. So it's not hidden. You know, I had a hard time finding them, so I made it so I could find them easily. So I honestly think this should be part of Angular. They should allow you to interpolate control names and subform names, because then it's more explicit. So for example, if we go back over here, you can see that I'm just doing a validation checking for an error on the form, but down below on the players, go down to the player here, I've got a similar thing where I'm looking for the player form, just looking for the error, so that I can decide that there are any errors before I submit the form. I can do a custom validator, because I find the Angular way, it doesn't validate everything I always want to validate. I always find myself having to write some validation that isn't just what Angular validates. And so this gives me a way to easily do that on dynamically generated form. If you want to build forms that are dynamically generated from, say, JSON files, or come from a NoSQL database where you've got nested JSON objects, and you want to just build the form without having to pre-script it, then using this means you can have, recursive ng repeats and build arbitrarily complex forms. So an example of that, this is from one of the UIs that we use at SaltStack. This is data about a particular server that is a deeply nested set of dictionaries. So it's an Angular form that is generated recursively from those nested set of dictionaries. And it'll nest arbitrarily deeply. Right now this one only goes a couple of levels down, but it'll go as far, it'll just go as far as it needs to go to fill out the form. And so if you wanted to make any of those fields editable, then with these directives you can make them editable and find them very easily, because you could name them however you want to name them, and you'd be able to use the same iterator the same naming convention and scoping convention you use to name them, to find them, to do any kind of validation. So that was pretty much, the talk about how to do that with a couple of directives. So are there any questions?
So you said you made this public somewhere. Where can we get it?
There's my... Angular Gold. So it's under my GitHub project. So those directives are there. And it's easy to convert the CoffeeScript to JavaScript if you're not familiar. You can just copy and paste the CoffeeScript into a CoffeeScript to JavaScript converter. Any other questions? Was that back here? No? All right, well, that's a couple of ways to do dynamic forms using directives that allow you to name the inputs and get access to them. So thank you very much.